Before the sun dipped behind the Wyoming plains, Calder Nash believed he knew the measure of the woman scrubbing his kitchen floor. Willa Shepherd was quiet, distant, and he was certain a thief. Whiskey coins, cufflinks, even his grandfather's gold pocket watch had vanished since her arrival. And each evening she vanished too, slipping away along a lonely trail no one used anymore. But when Calder finally followed suspicion, gave way to something he never expected. In a crumbling shack on forgotten land, he found not a cache of stolen goods, but 6 half-starved children rushing into her arms. Every missing item had been food medicine or warmth for them. And those children were not strangers. They were the sons and daughters of the 6 men who had died defending the Nash Ranch men Calder's own grandfather had vowed to care for. That vow had been buried with him. Until now. What Calder uncovered that night would not only shatter his pride, it would demand penance. And by the time dawn broke, he would understand that the true measure of a life wasn't what you owned, but what you protected. And Willa Shepherd had been protecting far more than he ever imagined. The sun hung low and coppery over the Wyoming plains, stretching its dying light across the weather-worn boards of the Nash Ranch. Golden shadows bled across the prairie grasses and licked the edges of the main house like the last breath of a story too old to retell. Inside, Calder Nash stood at the bay window of his study, still as a statue carved from the bones of the frontier. His arms were locked tight across his chest, and the lines in his weathered face looked deeper than the soil his family had plowed for generations. Out beyond the glass, through a thin curtain of lace his mother once sewed by hand, he watched the figure of Willa Shepherd kneeling on the kitchen floor. She moved slowly, deliberate, mechanical, as though she were trying to erase something only she could see. The mop worked in circles over a patch of tile already spotless, but she didn't stop. Her dress hung loose from her thin shoulders, its seams near unraveling, and stray wisps of hair clung to her sweat-dampened brow. She didn't glance toward the window, yet Calder felt sure she knew she was being watched. He hadn't trusted her since the day she arrived, not because of her quietness or the way she refused to meet his eyes, but because things had begun to vanish. First it was whiskey, then cufflinks, a set of coins that always rested on his dresser. Then last week the watch, his grandfather's gold pocket watch, gone. And before that, his mother's locket. Nothing flashy had ever mattered to Calder Nash. But legacy did. Order did. Trust, once broken, was near impossible to mend. And in his world, things either had a place or they didn't. Willa Shepherd didn't quite fit. She'd shown up one dry afternoon months ago, threadbare and soft-spoken, saying little more than that she could clean and didn't need much. He'd taken her in partly from decency, partly out of a sense of responsibility. The ranch needed tending, and she was the kind of woman no one else seemed willing to help a widow with calloused hands and haunted eyes. But now he wondered if pity had blinded him. She didn't linger after chores, didn't speak unless spoken to. And every evening, right before sundown, she wrapped that same faded shawl tight around her shoulders, no matter the weather, and left by the back path. It was the same routine every time. But today, something about it snagged him. She paused at the threshold, one hand resting on the doorframe, not moving, just listening. Then she turned, not all the way, just enough for the outline of her jaw to catch the light, and slipped out into the dying sun. And Calder Nash, a man who had buried his emotions long ago under the same soil that held his father's bones, had had enough of wondering. Enough of guilt blooming without proof. Enough of watching shadows stretch across his home without knowing what they hid. He took down his hat from the wall, settled it low over his brow, and stepped out into the wind. The boards of the back porch creaked beneath his boots, sharp and sure like judgment. In the barn, Bramble, his stallion, chestnut and restless, snorted at the scent of purpose. Calder mounted without a word and turned the horse toward the trail Willa always took, letting the sun's last light guide him over familiar land that suddenly felt full of secrets. He didn't know what he expected to find. A hidden stash. A secret rendezvous. Some long con that made a fool of the Nash name. But as the wind stirred the prairie grass and dusk swallowed the sky, Calder Nash rode out not just to catch a thief, but to discover the woman he'd overlooked. And the truth was going to wreck him. The trail Willa took wasn't one Calder Nash had ridden in years. It ran south past the split-rail boundary fence, then veered hard across a swath of land, long-thought-abandoned rough country choked with mesquite, where the wind spoke in dry whispers and jackrabbits moved like ghosts. She walked it with quiet certainty, her figure small but unwavering against the rising dusk. Calder followed at a careful distance, his stallion's hooves muffled by patches of sand and prairie grass. He kept low in the saddle, the brim of his hat casting deep shadows across his face. He didn't want her to see him, not yet. He needed to know where this strange path ended, and what secrets it carried. Willa wasn't heading to town, nor toward the river trail where some ranch hands still camped in lean-tos with coffee pots and campfires. She was cutting deeper into forgotten land that once belonged to Calder's grandfather, Henry Nash, but had been left to ruin after a fire gutted the outbuildings and time wore down what nature hadn't burned. As she disappeared into a hollow nestled between two rocky rises, Calder dismounted and tethered Bramble beneath a twisted juniper. The horse whickered softly, but stilled, trained for patience. Boots quiet on the earth. Calder crept along a deer path that wound down into the draw. The wind had shifted cooler now, brushing against the back of his neck like a warning. He crouched low as he reached the crest and looked down into the basin. That's when he saw it. The shack stood like a ghost of memory, half-collapsed roof, broken window panes stuffed with rags, a crooked chimney leaking thin threads of smoke. Yet someone had swept the steps clean. The path to the door was lined with boot tracks, and inside a light flickered warm and gold against the failing sky. It wasn't abandoned. It was alive. Willa stepped inside with the slow reverence of someone entering sacred ground. Calder's breath caught. A second later the door burst open again, not in fear, but in joy. Children spilled out into the fading light. Not one or two, but 6. Dirty-faced, barefoot clothes patched and faded, but grinning like it was Christmas. Miss Willa. Miss Willa's back. Their voices rang out high and raw with excitement. One little girl nearly tripped over herself racing to her. Willa caught her in her arms, lifting her briefly before lowering her gently to the porch. Calder stared, dumbfounded. He'd expected a lover in hiding, a criminal camp, maybe a family scam. But not this. These were children, thin, weather-worn, forgotten by the world, and they adored her. He inched through the scrub brush and ducked behind a cluster of sage, finding a narrow break in the wallboards where he could see clearly. Inside, Willa unpacked her satchel with a tenderness that bordered on ritual, a heel of bread wrapped in cloth, 2 bruised apples, a small tin of jam, soap shaved down to a sliver, thread, a pair of wool socks hand-darned with mismatched yarn. He recognized all of it, bits and pieces he had once called lost, now laid gently onto a splintered table, like offerings at an altar. The eldest boy, perhaps 11 or 12, was already sweeping the cabin's dirt floor, keeping the smaller ones from crowding her too tightly. One of them coughed a harsh, chest-deep sound, and Willa turned instantly. "Micah," she said softly, kneeling beside the boy and placing her hand on his forehead. Her voice was all comfort, no alarm. "Still running hot, love? Let's get you lying down." She guided him to a mattress on the floor made of old quilts and hay, then unwrapped a brown glass bottle from her satchel. Calder blinked. That bottle had sat on his medicine shelf just last week. A rare tonic prescribed only for respiratory illness. He'd assumed a ranch hand had swiped it, but now he watched her pour a careful spoonful and press it to the boy's lips, coaxing him to drink. This wasn't theft. This was survival, the kind that came with sacrifice written in every line of her face. Willa's shoulders sagged as she sat beside Micah, brushing back his damp hair. Her fingers trembled, not dramatically, just enough for someone paying close attention to see. Calder saw, and for the first time in a long while his assumptions wavered. Inside that crumbling structure he didn't see a criminal. He saw a woman saving what little was left of something sacred. He saw soup being stirred in a cracked pot over a fire that shouldn't have worked, bread broken and passed out in even pieces, children singing nonsense songs while waiting their turn for supper. It was a kind of family ragged and stitched together from grief and need, but family all the same. And at the center of it was Willa Shepherd. Not a maid, not a liar, not a thief. A guardian, a woman doing what no one else had. Not for glory, not even for thanks, just because someone had to. Calder's knees pressed into the dirt, and he felt it something old and shameful rising in his chest like smoke after lightning. Every missing coin, every borrowed item, every shadow he'd cast on her name. It all burned now under the truth. She hadn't stolen from him. She'd borrowed pieces of his world to keep theirs intact. He shifted slightly to ease the weight on his legs, and the movement made one of the floorboards creak, just enough to draw a glance from inside. Willa froze. Her eyes scanned the window, her body tense for just a heartbeat. But then she returned to the children smoothing Micah's blanket. She didn't suspect him. She had no time for suspicion, only for care. Calder backed away from the window breath caught somewhere between his ribs. He had followed her expecting deception. Instead, he had stumbled upon grace, and the path forward, he realized, wouldn't be about punishment. It would be about penance. From his hidden vantage, Calder Nash remained rooted in place, though everything inside him had begun to shift. The wind rustled through the grass behind him, carrying with it the faint hum of Willa Shepherd's voice as she coaxed the sick boy Micah into rest. The other children moved around the cabin in small, worn patterns familiar with their roles. One stirred the fire. Another folded clothing into neat stacks. A girl no older than 7 tried to sweep dust into a corner with a broom missing half its bristles. No one bickered. No one slacked off. This was not a place of disorder. It was a kind of sanctuary run not by rules, but by presence. Willa's presence. Calder shifted his weight, careful not to make a sound. He couldn't take his eyes off her. Every time she stood, she did so slowly, bracing herself on the edge of the table, one hand pressed to her side like something inside was pulling at her. Her steps were steady, but not strong. She moved like someone whose body was failing her inch by inch, but whose soul refused to yield. That's when Calder saw it, the gray under her eyes, the way her shoulders curled inward after she thought no one was looking, the shallow rise and fall of her chest. She wasn't just tired. She was sick, and she'd been hiding it. But why? Why keep going? Why work herself to the edge of collapse every day and every night for children that weren't hers? The answer came in fragments in the quiet way they touched her, how they leaned into her side, called her name like it was a prayer, looked at her not like a servant or even a caretaker, but like something sacred. She was their tether, their warmth in a world that had turned cold. As Calder watched, a moment unfolded that made his breath catch. One of the younger boys, barefoot and sullen, accidentally knocked over the pot of rice Willa had just managed to cook. The thin meal scattered across the dirt floor. The boy looked up, eyes wide, bracing for punishment. But Willa didn't raise her voice, didn't sigh. She simply bent down, rested a hand on his small back, and said softly, "It's all right, Emmett. It was just an accident. Let's clean it up together." She smiled, a tired, achingly tender smile, and the boy melted into her side. Calder had no name for the feeling in his chest. Not yet. It wasn't just guilt. It was something older, deeper, like recognizing a truth you'd buried for so long you forgot it was yours. And then came Thatcher. The eldest of the children, lean, cautious eyes, far too knowing for his age, approached Willa with a stack of coins. Calder squinted. His coins, the ones she had folded quickly into her apron, and left the ranch with that very afternoon. Willa paused as Thatcher handed them to her, his voice low and anxious. "The man came again," he said. "Said he'll wait 2 more days. After that, he said he knows who to talk to. Said we'd be split." Willa's entire frame seemed to still, not freeze, just settle into something heavy. She looked down at the coins, then reached into her bodice and pulled out the rest of her wages. Every last cent. Calder recognized the thread-wrapped roll. She'd tucked it away with the precision of someone who never expected to keep anything for long. She placed the money in Thatcher's hand with shaking fingers. "This'll buy us some time," she murmured. "We'll figure out the rest." Then she kissed the boy's temple and turned away just for a moment to compose herself. Calder's jaw clenched. He had handed her that money just hours before, half-hearted and cold, assuming she would pocket it selfishly. Now he watched her give it away without hesitation to preserve these children's unity. He'd mistaken desperation for deceit, self-sacrifice for scheming, and still she hadn't asked for help. She never once knocked on his office door, never once explained what those children meant, never once asked for more than her pay and the silence to do her work. Why? Because she didn't trust him to believe her, and why would she? He had watched her with suspicion from day one. He'd catalogued her poverty like proof of guilt. He'd let his own need for control blind him to something far holier than the rows of accounts and heirlooms he guarded like relics. Willa Shepherd had been running an entire life outside his gaze, a mission stitched together with frayed fabric, borrowed time, and a faith so fierce it defied logic. She was starving herself to feed children, giving up medicine to comfort the sick, letting her own illness eat her from the inside out, just to tuck blankets around children who still cried out for parents lost to the West's brutal indifference. And what had Calder done? He'd labeled her a thief. He'd tightened his grip on coins and family treasures, while she quietly used them as lifelines. Not for herself, but for 6 children who'd slipped through every crack, except the one she'd stood in front of with her bare hands outstretched. She didn't steal. She shielded. She didn't hoard. She gave. And now, she was fading. Right in front of him. Still singing lullabies, still breaking bread, still reaching for a strength she no longer had, just to be enough for them. And Calder Nash, a man who'd once believed land and legacy defined a life, now understood the quiet truth that had been living beneath his roof all along. Real legacy wasn't something you inherited. It was something you fought to protect. And Willa Shepherd had been fighting alone for far too long. The fire inside the old shack crackled low shadows climbing the warped wooden walls like old regrets. Outside, Calder Nash stayed crouched against the outer slats, every muscle aching from stillness, but his heart pounding with new, unbearable motion. The more he watched, the more the woman he once believed to be a liar began to feel like the only honest thing he'd seen in years. Willa Shepherd now sat in the only chair in the room, worn and splintered her body curled into it, like she no longer had the strength to hold herself upright. The children had begun to settle, worn down by the day. One by one they curled beneath blankets too thin for the cold, their small bodies forming a patchwork of survival on the floor. A hush fell across the room, broken only by the soft sounds of breathing and the rhythmic crack of the firewood. And then, quiet as a prayer, Willa reached into her dress. What she pulled out was small, folded, fragile with age. She held it with both hands, as if it were a living thing. A piece of parchment folded and refolded so many times the creases had become valleys. Calder leaned forward slightly, careful not to disturb the brittle brush beneath him. Willa unfolded the letter, and a photograph slipped into her lap. She picked it up gently, turned it toward the light. Her fingers hovered over the faces captured in grainy sepia. "I'm sorry, Silas," she whispered. Calder blinked. That name, Silas, rang like an echo from a distant place. She had said it once long ago on the day she'd been hired. Just a whisper. Willa Shepherd, widow of Silas. She hadn't spoken of him since. Willa pressed the photograph to her chest, and her voice cracked like old timber. "I couldn't save them. I couldn't save you. And now I'm failing the rest." Calder's jaw tightened. The weight of those words sank deep. Them. The children. Silas's children. Or something more. She set the photograph on the table and unfolded the letter. Her lips moved as she read silently. Then after a pause she drew in a shaky breath and reached again into the pocket of her dress. This time what emerged caught the firelight in a sharp gleam. Calder's breath left him. The gold pocket watch, his grandfather's, engraved with the initials H. Henry Hartley Nash, the man who had carved the first fence post on this land with blistered hands and a war-hardened heart. That watch had vanished weeks ago. Calder had blamed Willa in silence every day since. Now he watched her cradle it like a relic. "I didn't want to take it," she said softly. "But it's the only thing valuable enough to buy time. The only thing they'd accept to keep the children from being sold." Sold. The word twisted through Calder like a blade. She wasn't talking about thieves. She was talking about those children, those 6 fragile souls sleeping on the floor too young to understand how close they were to being lost again. There were men in the West, powerful, discreet, merciless, who relocated orphans. On paper it was legal. In practice it was trafficking. And Willa had been standing between those children and that fate with nothing but her wages and his stolen heirloom. No, not stolen. Repurposed, risked, guarded. He watched as she moved to the floor and pried up a loose board in the corner. Beneath it was a hollow lined with a scrap of cloth. A vault of desperation. Not gold. Not hidden whiskey or weapons. Just memory's tools of survival. A couple of coins, a silver ring, a pair of old military pins. And now she laid the pocket watch among them, slow and reverent. She paused, then pulled out the photograph once more. From Calder's angle, it angled just enough for him to see. 6 men in uniform, not soldiers in rank, but civilian fighters, stood in front of a crumbling fort wall. In the center of the photo stood his grandfather, tall and grim, hands clasped behind his back. The others. Calder felt the air leave his lungs. These weren't strangers. They were the 6 who'd died defending the Nash Ranch 2 decades earlier. Calder had been a boy barely old enough to understand what it meant when the men didn't come back. His grandfather had always said, they saved everything. But he never named them. Just hung their photo in the study and spoke of duty. And now here they were. Silas Shepherd was one of them. And these children, Willa's children, weren't orphans picked up by pity. They were the legacy of the men who'd given their lives for Calder's home. Willa stood now trembling and moved toward a low shelf. She withdrew an envelope, yellowed and worn, and turned it in her hands. Even through the firelight, Calder could make out the name written on the front, Calder Nash. She stared at it a long moment before whispering, "I should have given this to him the day I took the job. But I couldn't. Not after everything." She set it gently on the table next to the letter and photograph. Then came her final words. "Your grandfather promised us," she said, voice so low it nearly vanished. "He said no child of a man who died for this ranch would ever go without. But when he passed, that promise died with him, and I didn't have the courage to ask again." Calder closed his eyes. Every ounce of pride he had ever wrapped himself in his self-righteousness, his distrust, his cold silence cracked wide open. His grandfather had made a vow one carved in the blood of 6 men, a vow left to rot when Henry Nash died and the memory faded. But Willa remembered. She'd carried that promise on her back for 20 years with grief, with grit, with grace, and she had never once come to collect it. Until now. Not for herself, but for them, the children of the men who'd bled for the soil beneath Calder's boots. And suddenly Calder Nash didn't feel like a landowner anymore. He felt like a debtor, and he intended to pay. The night outside thickened like ink swallowing the horizon in silence. Inside the crumbling cabin, the fire had burned low, casting a soft amber glow across the slumbering forms on the floor. The children were curled beneath quilts and coats, huddled close in a patchwork of breath and warmth. From his hidden place beneath the window, Calder Nash remained motionless, though inside his soul was unraveling. He hadn't moved in hours, but he felt like he'd traveled 100 miles. The woman he had followed out of suspicion was no longer a mystery. She was a monument. Willa Shepherd had stood between ruin and redemption for 6 forgotten lives, children born from bravery, raised in absence, and nearly lost to a world that didn't care. She had done it all alone, and now she was fading. Calder could see it as clearly as he could see the moon climbing the sky behind her silhouette. Willa sat at the table, her body bowed like wheat beneath wind. Her face, usually composed in its quiet strength, now seemed distant, her eyes unfocused, her hands motionless. She stared at the letter she had written, the one bearing his name, as if trying to will herself to finish a task long delayed. Then her body shifted. Her fingers twitched, and without warning, she slid sideways out of the chair. It happened too fast for Grace. One moment she was upright, the next she crumpled like a paper doll, silent and helpless. Her shawl pooled around her like fallen wings. Calder didn't think. His boots tore through the dry earth and brush crashing through the cabin's front door before it could swing fully open. Wood splintered, startled gasps rose from the children, and the wind rushed in behind him like judgment. He was on his knees beside her in a heartbeat. "Willa," he said, breath shallow. "Willa, stay with me." Her eyes opened, cloudy and distant. But even now, even as her body failed her, her first words weren't about herself. "Please," she rasped, voice thin as thread. "Don't let them take the children. Don't let them be separated." Calder swallowed the lump in his throat, one hand cradling her head, the other fumbling for the pulse at her neck. "They won't. I swear it." He lifted her carefully, carrying her to the same bed of quilts she had prepared earlier for Micah. The boy, now half awake, blinked at Calder with confusion and fear. The children stirred around them. One clutched a doll, another whimpered. Then, like a shield rising in front of them all, Thatcher stepped forward. He didn't speak right away, just planted his feet between Calder and the rest. "Who are you?" he asked. Calder looked up, his voice low, hoarse. "My name is Calder Nash." Gasps, whispers. The name passed through the room like a storm front. "I own the ranch your fathers died for," he continued, standing slowly. "And I've wronged the woman who kept their memory alive. Thatcher didn't flinch, though his jaw tightened. "What are you going to do with us?" Calder looked around at the room, the makeshift beds, the stove burning low, the small pile of coins Willa had emptied from her purse. He didn't answer right away. He walked to the table, picked up the envelope with his name on it, and held it over his heart. "I'm going to keep a promise," he said. Before the sun had fully risen the next morning, Calder was already in motion. He rode through the night to town, wind howling in his ears as he hammered on the door of Dr. Elijah Crane, the best physician in 3 counties. "Come now," Calder ordered, not begging, but something close. "Bring everything. She's not going to last the day if we wait." When they returned to the cabin, Willa was fading in and out of consciousness. The doctor wasted no time. Pneumonia, exhaustion, malnutrition, it was all crashing down at once. A lesser soul would have already gone under, but Willa clung to life the same way she'd clung to the children, fiercely, silently, without complaint. "Whatever she needs," Calder told the doctor. "Medicine, food, care, she gets it. I don't care what it costs." That same day, Calder summoned his ranch hands. Supplies were hauled, wagons loaded, blankets, food, firewood, nails, and timber. By noon, the west wing of the Nash Ranch, shuttered for years, was being cleaned and repaired. The long-abandoned nursery was reopened. Dust swept from the floor windows, washed. The cookhouse doubled its output. The children didn't understand at first. They clung to one another, watching warily as Calder helped load what little they had into the wagon himself. "We're not taking anything from you," Thatcher said, arms folded tight. Calder nodded. "You're not. You're reclaiming what was owed. Long overdue." And when they arrived at the ranch house, Junie, the youngest girl, stepped inside and blinked at the light streaming through the big windows. She turned back and whispered, "Is this really ours?" Calder knelt beside her. "It is now," he said. Willa was placed in the largest guest room, her frame almost lost in the clean linens and wide bed. For 2 days she drifted in and out, unaware of the home that now pulsed with life around her. But the 3rd morning, when she opened her eyes and saw Junie asleep beside her, the silver locket clutched in her little hand, she knew. The promise hadn't died. It had just waited. Outside, Calder stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the children chase one another across the yard. Laughter had returned to a place that had known only wind and silence. He looked out at the land his grandfather had carved into the earth, but it wasn't legacy he saw anymore. It was family, a messy, mended, hard-earned family, and for the first time in his life, Calder Nash understood what it meant to carry a name with honor. Not because it was his, but because someone else had kept it alive. Time passed the way it does on the prairie, slow, sun-drenched, and quietly relentless. Seasons folded over the Nash Ranch, like quilt patches, gold harvests, silver snows, thunder rolling across the summer hills. But something had changed in the soil itself, something Calder Nash felt in the rhythm of every morning. Where silence once reigned, there was now motion, children's voices chasing echoes through the hallways, laughter trailing behind bare feet on porch boards, worn smooth. Willa Shepherd survived, though just barely. The illness had taken her strength for weeks, and healing came in slow layers. Rest, warmth, the kind of nourishment she had long denied herself. Calder spared nothing. Fresh linens broth made from scratch, visits from Dr. Crane twice a week. He never once asked her to explain herself. He already knew. Every corner of the ranch bore her quiet fingerprints now, in the way the kitchen ran smoother in the children's growing ease and the softness that had returned to a house once built on sharp edges. She was no longer just the maid. She was the heart of the home. The children began to bloom. Thatcher, once hard-eyed and watchful, now worked in the stables and learned the rhythm of saddles and hooves. He rarely smiled, but when he did, it was real. Micah, no longer pale and trembling, was found most afternoons beside Calder's bookkeeper, poring over ranch ledgers with a brow furrowed in thought. And little Junie, wild-haired and barefoot, danced through the fields at dusk, that silver locket bouncing against her chest like a bell of memory. She wore it every day. In town, whispers stirred. Some called it scandal, an old rancher bringing in a bunch of strays. Others said it was charity. But Calder didn't bother correcting them. He simply said, "They're the children of 6 men braver than I'll ever be. And Willa, she's the one who carried them here." Inside his study, the gold pocket watch rested once more on the mantel. But beside it now stood something more sacred, a sepia-toned photograph in a polished frame. Willa and the 6 children smiling soft and tired, with Calder standing just behind one hand resting on the chair where Junie sat, the other resting on his chest like a vow. He had not remarried. He didn't need to. What bound him to Willa was not ceremony, but something quieter. A partnership forged in silence and cemented in action. She would never call herself the ranch's matron, but everyone else did. She kept the meals warm, the beds made the heart steady. Years later, when the children were grown, Thatcher off managing a horse breeding line, Micah working numbers in town, and Junie taking over the household duties herself, the ranch still thrived. Not just from cattle or land, but from memory, from love, from a promise once forgotten and finally fulfilled. And Calder Nash, who once measured a man by control and suspicion, now understood that legacy wasn't what you kept locked in a drawer. It was what you passed on with open hands. If this story moved your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with someone who believes in second chances. At Whispers of the West, we bring you tales of redemption, quiet courage, and the kind of love that lingers. Join our frontier family where every whisper tells a story worth remembering.